Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Pfeffer, the managing editor of Dice News, and welcome to our latest Google Hangout. Today, we're going to be talking about training and the way that employees are increasingly having to foot their own bill for training because their companies just don't want to bear the expense. Our panel today is Catherine Powell, who's the talent community guide for the Dice talent community on software engineering. We have David Bolton, who's the guide for our C++, C# community, as well as our Java community, and Sharadon, who's a training specialist and career counselor for Nova Connect, a workforce investment board out in Silicon Valley. Catherine, let me start with you. What do you think about this? What are you seeing out there in terms of training?
Well, Mark, I've been a VP of engineering here in Boston for about 10 years now, and I tell you, one thing I've definitely seen is my training budget keeps getting smaller. That's something that I think a lot of us are seeing, particularly those of us who work in, some of your smaller firms, your startups all the way up to, 10 or even $50 million a year. That doesn't really translate to a lot of money for training. So one of the trends that we're really seeing is a need for employees to really instigate and advocate for training to make use of what little budget there is, and then also seeking out a lot of alternative needs, whether it's non-traditional training, meetups, free online courses, things like that, to really take charge of their own education.
Sherry, you must be seeing a lot of this, or a lot of the impact of it. Employers are being really picky about who they hire, and sometimes if the person doesn't have the skills already in place, they don't want to bother to bring them on because they don't want to have to train them. How much trouble is that causing for people?
It's definitely a big issue. We see a lot of folks who have worked hard in their tech field and they've done a project, they get laid off or they quit and they pop their head up and all of a sudden they find they're way behind in their skills. And so getting up to speed quickly with the new set of skills that employers want is a key issue.
So David, what's your experience with this? You've taken a lot of online courses and trained yourself in a lot of languages.
I've found that I have had to do this. Unless you work for a really, really big firm, in my experience, you have to take control of training for yourself. The smaller firms, 100, 200-man outfits, they don't have the budgets. They won't train you. And in the IT business in particular, I find there's about a 5 to 7 year changeover cycle where some technologies become obsolete and other ones come along, and you have to stay on top of those if you want to keep in the business. I'm lucky in one respect. I'm still doing stuff that I learned 14 years ago, but most of the time you have to learn new stuff. And MOOCs in particular, I think, are wonderful. I learned Python through Coursera last year, and I've been looking at doing Scala on one as well. And I think for anybody who wants to train themselves, find a MOOC. There's plenty of them around, and they're excellent.
Where's a good place to find them?
There's three main websites. There's Coursera.org, which is probably the big one. That's the one that's got all the Ivy League universities, and you're getting really top professors and they cost nothing, so they're wonderful. The other two are there's Udemy, UDEMY, and edx.com. And those are more computer oriented. Coursera tends to be across a lot more fields. Coursera is the one I've had the main experience with, but it's definitely worth a look for anybody, not just IT, but sort of things like mathematics or medicine. I love them. I think they're great.
Mm-hmm.
Catherine, you're often on the other side of the table. You're doing the hiring.
Yes.
How do you approach this? I mean, what are your thoughts on being willing to pick up somebody who needs training, or how much do you expect from a candidate to have?
Well, I think David makes a really good point. Whatever technology we're using today, I can guarantee you in 5 years it'll be something else, even if you're with the same firm or with the same company. And if you've moved companies, that's even more likely to be true. Today everyone's doing Ruby on Rails and Go, and that's the hot young web technology. Well, that's great. Nobody was doing that 5 years ago. 10 years ago, they weren't doing that. It was ASP.NET and Java, or people were still using PHP or C, and you're seeing a lot of those fall off. They're still very popular, but they're falling off, and skills are needing to change. So I would definitely in particular, both languages and then also technology sets as well. If you've been a Win32 desktop programmer, go take a course on web programming, take a course on mobile programming, as David's doing it. I came out of storage, and I'm in web programming now. And that was a move I had to make on my own, because there was no way that a hiring manager at a web program company was going to look at me compared to a bunch of web developers and say, well, sure, we can train her. We all sort of intellectually, as hiring managers, recognize that we're going to need to train people. So one of the things that we look for is people who've shown that they can learn effectively, people who have successfully moved from one technology stack to another, from one language to another, people who show signs that they are working on their own, whether that's working with open source software, taking courses, things like that, evidence that you're trainable, frankly, that you're self-guided learning goes a long way for a hiring manager who wants to know you have that skill set.
So is that what you're looking for more than anything else, is the fact that somebody might be trainable, or do you want them to come in with the full package already?
Well, clearly, if they have the full package, that's ideal. But as I always tell all the recruiters who call me, I'll take somebody who's been a Java web developer because I can teach them Rails. Someone who hasn't shown that they can do any kind of development, well, that's a bigger gamble. So showing me that you have the learning capabilities, I can teach you a technology. And I think that's fairly common.
Yeah, can I make a comment? For folks who end up unemployed, I think that they find, oh my goodness, and I recommend be a little proactive, and even when you're in a job once a year, pop your head up and say, what's the latest technology? It's easier to bump from one technology, one generation to the next rather than skip 3 or 4. And so if you do a yearly self-assessment, what's happening out in the market, how do I stand up against that, you're going to find it easier to keep yourself current.
Sharadon, given your position, do you talk to a lot of employers, and what do they, what's your take on the pulse of this? Are employers as resistant to having to train people as a lot of job seekers say they are?
I think Catherine hit it on the head that, occasionally they're willing to take people who are really smart and they will teach them. But most of the time they really want plug and play folks. They want new people to come in, bam, they want them to be able to contribute immediately. But if they need to train someone, they want someone who has shown an effort to keep themselves up to date. Maybe they haven't used all of the new technologies, but they've tried to learn them on their own. They've tried to find opportunities to see if they can find experience or opportunities to volunteer. That kind of initiative and learning goes a long way with employers.
Some of this training, though, can be pretty expensive, and that's something I hear a lot from job candidates, saying they don't really have the money to take some of these training courses. And David, how have you gotten around the expense?
Well, the MOOCs are obviously the free ones. Over here in the UK, and I think it's probably similar prices in the States, you're talking about $3,000 for a week's training from a professional training company, and I think there's very few people can afford to pay that themselves. It's far cheaper to sit down for a few hours with a book and a compiler and learn a new language if necessary. And the best way to do that is to write something meaningful. But yeah, I don't spend a lot on training apart from books, and that's it. Sort of, it's my time that is the costly thing, not the money for the courses. I'd love to do courses, but I don't think anybody can afford them unless you work for a bank or something like that. And the reason I say that is I worked for a bank, and they were very, very good about putting you on training courses if you wanted, if it was relevant to what you were doing. But the rest of the world, yeah.
Catherine, you're looking to jump in.
Yeah, if I could step in here just briefly. One of the things that I'll point out is a structured course can be a very expensive thing. You're talking several hundred to several $1,000s for a week or 2 weeks of work. However, a lot of those same courses are available directly from universities at no cost. They're self-guided, they don't have an instructor at that point, but you can still go through all the material. You have access to it. I know, for example, MIT, Stanford, Princeton, University of Chicago, they all put a lot of their courses online and they're freely available at no cost to you. The only thing you're missing out on there is the actual instructor. But there are mailing lists that are dedicated to going through these course materials and helping each other out through them. I'd also point out that meetups, whether they're in person if you're in a city or virtual meetups, are great places to go. In particular, look for consulting firms in your town who are technology consulting firms. They frequently will put on programs or sponsor programs that are free to you to come. They're touting how expert they are in a technology, and you're always welcome to go and eat some free pizza and learn from them. They're more than happy to teach because it helps their brand and it helps you learn, and it's a win for everybody.
Sharon, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me mention two things. One, if folks are unemployed within the U.S., there are a chance to get some training paid for through Workforce Investment Act training funds. So they ought to look for a local site and see if they qualify. So that's one thing. But there are a lot of online low cost, and then there's also, at least in our area and in many other areas, there are community colleges that offer some great programs. We have community colleges that offer the same program as the private training companies for a fraction of the cost. So keep those in mind. And then a couple of websites that I recommend one is called skilledup.com, and skilledup.com is an aggregator. And what it does is you go in and you put in what type of training you're searching for. You can say if you want it free or if you're willing to spend up to $200 or whatever it is, and it will populate a whole list of potential ways to get training in that topic. It's a great website.
We've been touching on cost, and I'm just kind of wondering, is cost an indicator of the quality of a program? Sharadon?
I don't think it necessarily is. Sometimes if you're in an area where there's a lot of, for example, some electrical engineering training where people are going to need boards and they're going to need to do some projects like that, sometimes it is an indication of the quality, but it's important to shop around because private vendors are usually more expensive than public. And you just have to see what's really in the course and what you're going to get out of it and what you actually get to do. I always think it's much better to do a project, get your hands dirty, do some programming rather than just read about it.
Catherine, I see you're nodding, so you think it's a similar thing?
Oh, absolutely. Saying I've taken training in blah that's nice. Saying I built this, grocery shopping application for my wife, that shows me you probably understand it. And I think David made this point earlier. You've really learned something when you've built a piece of software with it.
Does it really matter if, in terms of learning the language or whatever the technology is? Does it really matter whether it's a formal program or an informal program, a book, or a friend teaching you the language? Or is it just really the end result that people are going to look at?
I think it's the result. Some people learn better in formal programs or informal programs, but that's really up to you. I think, in particular, a lot of software engineers tend to be very self-directed problem solver types. So informal learning can be completely adequate, particularly once you've been around the industry for a while and you've sort of learned the commonalities across technologies. Then informal learning can be completely effective.
Let's talk about where people can find the resources or find the places where they can get the training they're looking for. David, you've talked about MOOCs and you've talked about books. Where did you find the right MOOCs to take?
Well, a lot of the time, actually, I just use the big search engine. Google to find a lot of the materials. For programming as well, there's several websites that when you're learning a new technology, there's one in particular I think is wonderful called Stack Overflow. They've answered virtually every question you can come up with. If you search for it on Google, it's usually a Stack Overflow result that shows there, and it's just amazing just how good it is having that resource there to help you learn. I've mentioned the MOOCs. Books these days, funny enough, I think books are becoming less essential, and you can see I've got a massive library here, but I find I don't need to use books quite as much for learning, or maybe I've just learned so much over the years. Yeah, that's...
And Sharadon, how about you? There must be resources that you point people to.
Certainly there are, and I think it depends a little bit on people's learning style. A lot of developers and programmers feel pretty good at going out in there and just playing with the programs, but some people I find do much better in structured programs. And if you're that kind of person, then it's better to find a class. Whether it's online or a class, again, if you have something that you can show for it, a project, all the better. And in certain fields today, certification's really important. So if you're learning something where there's a certification, if you can show that you passed that exam and you have that certification, that can be helpful, like Salesforce developers. If they can pass the Salesforce developer exam, that's usually well looked upon by employers.
Catherine, do you look at certifications in any particular way? Are they a real strength?
For some things, it depends on what you're doing, and I think it's specific to the certification. Salesforce and in IT, more so than in development, I think. There are a lot of development certifications out there, particularly some of the Microsoft certifications that, frankly, they don't really help you much, at least in some of the smaller organizations. They're looked on as being too easy, frankly, and not much of a differentiator. But the really sort of more specialized technologies. So if you want to go get your Cisco certified network administrator, that's a good one to have. If you want to go get a Salesforce certification or any very specific technology like that, any sort of major vendor-based technology, I think. In the more common technologies, your Java, .NET certifications, those I think have less value.
David, what's your experience been with certifications? I'm not sure if you have them and how have they paid off for you?
I haven't. I've actually, I've never found them to be that much of a benefit for me. Over the years, I've seen some of the Microsoft ones that Catherine mentioned, but I never felt the need for those. And to be honest, most of the jobs I've gone to, they've not asked for that. The technology, the one problem is the technology does change. It's always moving forward. So if you learn, if you do a certification, say for C# 2, within a year or so, well, there's C# 3, 4, 4, and 5. So you have to either keep up your certifications or else they just become obsolete very, very quickly. So I've just tended to avoid those and not done them.
One thing I will say, Mark, is that it's very cultural. So I've worked with people, for example, in Germany or in India, and they tell me that culturally it's very different there. In some cases, people have had to get a certification as a prerequisite for even getting hired for a job. It's like having a GED or a bachelor's degree here in some situations. So I would say that with regard to certifications in particular, you should look around and see how many of them are being really required in job postings, because that might be an indicator that there's a cultural stronger need for them where you are.
I see them used, I agree, it's much more common in IT than programming, but I see them used by as employers as a quick way to screen out a lot of folks. When they have many, many resumes, if they can tick off that box that we only want people with certain certifications, it just gives them a smaller pool to look at.
Well, I'd say in over here in particular in the UK, it's been a degree, a bachelor's, that's really been the certificate that they need to get into the industry. And as there've been more and more people gone into university, they've raised the minimum standard. So the bar here is what's called a 2-1 degree, which is one less than a first class degree. The ironic thing is, 30 years ago when I graduated, I just had a normal degree, and so there's jobs now I can't actually go for because I'm not a recent graduate. So degrees, even degrees, get devalued over time.
We've touched on this before, but I'm curious if a candidate wants to prove how much or how well he knows technology, a language, or whatever. What's the best way to really stand out with that? I mean, obviously they can build an app, they can build their own solution to something. But Catherine, what do you look for when someone comes in with their own product, as it were?
So I look for a few things. I like many employers give a programming problem as part of an interview process. So if you've made it that far, we're going to ask to see some of your code. One of the trends that I've seen in Boston, and I think this is just the beginnings of a trend, is less of the walk into an interview room and code on the whiteboard and more of a homework problem style, where you'll be sent a problem to do that is somewhat representative of the problem space you'll be working in. So for example, the one that I use is, here is a spec, go build a small web application when I'm hiring for web developers. I think you're starting to see that trend of homework problems. That's really your chance to show that you know your stuff. If you haven't yet gotten that far, showing you've worked on similar problems or showing longevity and variety of work. So if you've successfully contributed to open source software, for example, particularly in the technology space, that's a real standout point for people. So especially if you're unemployed and you have time to do that kind of contribution, I think that's a great way to really make yourself stand out. You know, someone, for example, who has contributed to a major Java open source or a major Ruby on Rails open source application, the phone screen at that point is pro forma. That person's pretty much made it to the interview just on the strength of their contributions. So if you have the time and ability to do that, that's great. And then beyond that, just using your application to show that you can solve some hard problems. You can do a little bit more than hello world. Makes you stand out.
Sharadon, you must talk to a lot of people who are asking this very question, I'd imagine, about what should they build, what should they post in terms of code or something. You know, what's the most effective thing you think they can come in with?
Well, I certainly, I am seeing the same trend that Catherine just mentioned of homework assignment programming. That quite a few people get those now for job interviews, so I'm definitely seeing that. So you kind of think through your mind, how am I going to demonstrate that I have that skill? I liked what Catherine said. So, you know, people are trying to do projects that show that they have a variety of skills. I recommend that if you can show that you have what you talked about, variety, but if the skill's not just in one place, but you can use that skill in multiple applications, that's usually well received in an interview. The other thing I mentioned is that I've had some clients have really good success doing some programming and design competitions. And I have a bunch of websites for some of those competitions, and people have been able to demonstrate that, hey, I took third place in this programming competition, and let me show you what I did. So that's a creative way to try to demonstrate a skill.
Is there a way someone can prepare, you know, for that homework assignment to sort of maybe get some hints as to what a particular company might be looking for?
Some companies provide, a client just brought in a couple of weeks ago, and they had sent him an email with some good hints and ways to prepare. Beyond that, I'm not sure. That's probably a good question for Catherine, how they can best prepare.
Okay, Catherine?
So I think write code. write a lot of code. That's the only way you're going to get better at writing code. There are also there are a few websites out there. Exercism.io, exercism.io is a good one. They're starting to spring up where they explicitly exist to provide feedback on your code. So they'll give you an exercise. Hey, write a loop reversal, for example. And you can put up your code and they'll give you feedback on it. And it's not very good for your ego, but it's really good for your programming skills. So doing those kinds of exercises can also be really helpful. I think if you're just looking to make sure that when you go in, you have confidence in your code and your structure of your code and the quality of your code, practice. Keep practicing.
We're sort of starting to run out of time here, so I thought maybe I'd just ask for everybody's closing thoughts. And David, why don't we start with you?
Okay, no, just following on from what Catherine was saying, there are a number of websites. Top Coders is one. Project Euler is another, where you can find several hundred programming problems, and you can then have a go at that. And they have an automated entry, so you can submit it and see how well you've done. It's not a competition as such, but you're sort of competing. It's like competing against the clock. You want to be able to write good code, and use websites like that. That's my recommendation.
Catherine, any closing thoughts?
Just good luck to all of us. I think we're in a world now where we're not being spoon-fed our futures, and I think that's great, and that it gives us a lot of freedom, and it's a little scary, but I think if we're willing to really take the reins of our own careers, we can do a lot of really interesting things with it.
And Sharadon, how about you?
My final comment would be, following on to that, is just assume you're responsible for your own career and your development, and be proactive about it, and keep going and keep learning every year. So many, certain professions have what they call career, we're continuing ed units you have to do every year. If you're in programming, you aren't required to do that, but just put that discipline into your life. Every year, what am I going to learn?
Well, I want to thank everybody here. Thank the panel, David Bolton, Catherine Powell, and Sharadon Smith. I want to thank our producer, Yvonne Lee, who put this whole discussion together. I want to thank you for watching. Be sure to check us out at news.dice.com. I'm Mark Pfeffer, the managing editor, and we will see you next time.